When you think of Massachusetts, what comes to mind? Probably Pilgrims, the American Revolution, maybe some really old universities, right? But here's the thing, the real story of Massachusetts is all about reinvention. It's this constant cycle, a place that was literally born from dissent, and has just kept remaking itself over and over again to lead the country. So let's dig into how that rebellious spirit became its secret sauce for change.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start at the very beginning with its pre-colonial roots, then dive into its role as the cradle of the revolution. After that, we'll see how it became an industrial powerhouse, hit a major decline, and then reinvented itself all over again.
Okay, so to really get Massachusetts, you have to rewind the clock. Way back, before any English ships even showed up, because this land was already home to some amazing cultures for centuries. So this land, which actually gets its name from the Massachusetts tribe, was this bustling network of villages and hunting grounds, home to peoples like the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc. But then the Europeans arrived, and they brought something with them that was completely invisible but utterly devastating: disease. Between 1617 and 1619, a massive epidemic just ripped through the region. It wiped out up to 90% of the native population. I mean, think about that. It just tragically and completely changed everything, right before the first English settlers decided to stay for good. So into this totally changed world, the Pilgrims show up in 1620. They're looking for religious freedom, and they write up the Mayflower Compact, which is, one of the first stabs at self-government in America. Things started off okay. They formed an alliance with the Wampanoag, which led to that famous First Thanksgiving in 1621. But then, just 10 years later, a much, much larger wave of Puritans arrives, the Great Migration, and they set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that fragile peace? Well, it absolutely shattered in 1675 with King Philip's War. This was one of the most brutal, bloody conflicts in early American history. It completely devastated the region and just forever changed the relationship between the colonists and the Native Americans. So you can already see this theme of dissent baked into the colony's DNA, right? Well, that same spirit is about to set the stage for its next big act, a full-blown political rebellion against, just the biggest empire on the planet.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did this colony of English subjects manage to become the spark that lit a global fire? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was more like a slow burn, a series of events that just kept getting worse and worse.
It really started with money and control. Britain started tightening the screws economically, passing acts to control who the colonies could trade with and how their money worked. This wasn't just about taxes. It was about who was in charge. Well, tensions finally exploded in 1770. British soldiers fired on a crowd, the Boston Massacre. A few years later, you get the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped a whole bunch of British tea right into the harbor. And Britain's response? They came down hard. Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port and basically took away their right to govern themselves. The funny thing is, it was meant to isolate and punish Massachusetts, but it did the exact opposite. It brought all the colonies together against the king.
And there it is. In early 1775, Parliament makes it official. That's the moment the line is drawn in the sand. No more arguments, no more petitions. As far as London was concerned, Massachusetts was officially in a state of rebellion. There was no going back. And it didn't take long for that declaration to turn into a full-blown war. Just 2 months later, you get the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. The fighting had started. The British technically won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it cost them dearly. They just couldn't break the colonial siege of Boston. In fact, by March of '76, George Washington's army actually forced the British to pack up and leave the city. That was a huge first win for the colonies. And to top it off, the Springfield Arsenal was founded, making sure Massachusetts would be the armory for this new nation. Okay, so winning a war against an empire is one thing. That's hard enough. But now what? How do you actually build a stable government from scratch based on all these revolutionary ideas? That, my friends, was a totally different kind of fight, and Massachusetts was right in the thick of it. And get this, while the war was still going on, Massachusetts was already thinking about the future. In 1780, they adopted their own state constitution, mostly written by John Adams. And here's the truly groundbreaking part. Its language about all men being born free and equal was used by the courts to abolish slavery in the state. That made Massachusetts the first state in the new U.S. to do so.
This document was so forward-thinking, it's actually the oldest functioning written constitution still in use anywhere in the world today. How cool is that? But, peace didn't solve everything. A really bad economic depression hit, and it hit the farmers in western Massachusetts especially hard. This led to an armed uprising called Shays's Rebellion, where indebted farmers literally shut down the courts to stop them from losing their land. Now, the rebellion was eventually put down, but it scared the absolute daylights out of the new nation's leaders. It was a massive wake-up call that showed just how weak the first national government was. And that fear, it was a major reason why they decided to scrap the whole thing and draft the U.S. Constitution. So, after sparking a political revolution, what's next for Massachusetts? Well, how about an industrial one? This is the state's next huge reinvention, and it's one that's going to change not just Massachusetts, but the entire country. And the change was just incredible. It was like night and day. The old economy, little farms, local shops, some shipping, was completely replaced by this new industrial monster. We're talking massive textile mills, precision manufacturing, and railroads spreading out like a spider web to connect it all to the rest of the world. Seriously, Massachusetts just became this hotbed of innovation. It was all about the firsts. They had the first truly integrated textile mill, a total game changer for manufacturing. The Springfield Armory basically perfected the idea of interchangeable parts. They had the country's first commercial railroad. New Bedford was the capital of the entire world's whaling industry. And hey, just for fun, they also invented two little sports you might have heard of, basketball and volleyball. No big deal. But all this change wasn't just happening in factories. That same energy, that same drive for innovation, it also sparked this incredible explosion of new ideas about society, about what it means to be human, and about basic rights. This place was just buzzing with big ideas. You had the abolitionist movement, led by people like William Lloyd Garrison, who were passionately demanding an immediate end to slavery. You had the transcendentalists, thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau, who were all about looking to nature and your own intuition for answers. And you had education reformers like Horace Mann, who came up with the radical idea of a public school for every child, a system that would literally shape the entire country. Of course, booms don't last forever. And when the 20th century rolled around, that mighty industrial engine started to cough and sputter. This was a really tough time, and it forced Massachusetts into, you guessed it, another massive reinvention. By the middle of the century, things were looking pretty bleak. Cheaper competition from other parts of the country, plus the Great Depression, just completely wrecked the state's signature industries like textiles and shoes. Those huge mills that had been the heart of cities like Lowell and Lawrence, they went quiet. The jobs disappeared, leaving behind what we'd now call a rust belt. But then something amazing happened. It was called the Massachusetts Miracle. So how'd they pull it off? They looked at what they still had, and one of their oldest assets was their incredible universities like Harvard and MIT. They used that brain power to pivot, to completely shift to a new economy based on high-tech, computers, and biotech, especially along the Route 128 highway, which became like the original Silicon Valley. And just look at the scale of this shift. It's staggering. In 1950, the state's economy was dominated by manufacturing jobs. Fast forward 50 years to 2000, and it has completely flipped. It's all about tech and services. This wasn't just fixing a problem. It was a complete and total reinvention of what Massachusetts was. And that brings us right up to the modern day, to the Massachusetts we know now, a place that's definitely shaped by all this history, but is still pushing the envelope. The last several decades have been packed with big moments. You have the Kennedy era, which really put Massachusetts at the center of national politics. Boston itself was physically remade by the absolutely massive Big Dig highway project. And that pioneering spirit, it's still there. Massachusetts became the very first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and it created the country's first universal health insurance plan. And of course, the tragedy of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013 was a terrible test, but it also showed the world just how resilient and strong the people there are. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see it, right? This repeating pattern: rebellion, innovation, decline, and then reinvention. From the very first Puritan rebels to today's tech pioneers, the one constant in Massachusetts is change. It just never seems to stand still, which really makes you wonder, what's the next chapter going to be? Hey, if you want to dive into the stories of other states, we've got a whole playlist of U.S. state histories you should check out. And if you like this explainer, do us a favor and subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.